She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could hear the smile in her voice before she even said a word. "Dad, I need to let you know something. My husband and I are leaving for Vancouver next week. And, well, we've already signed the papers on the cabin. It's sold." I stood there in the kitchen, holding my phone, looking out at the birch trees in the backyard. The same trees I'd planted with my wife 30 years ago, the summer before my daughter was born. "You sold the cabins," I said. "Don't make it weird. You haven't used it in 2 years. It was just sitting there." She hung up before I could answer, and honestly, I let her, because I already knew something she didn't. I'm 67 years old, and I live alone in a 2-story house in Barrie, Ontario, about 90 minutes north of Toronto. I worked for 34 years as a structural engineer for a firm out of Sudbury, and when I retired, I kept things simple. Modest pension, a bit of RSP savings, a small TFSA I'd been careful with since the accounts first came into existence. I don't need much. Never did. The cabin was different. My wife, Sandra, she passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer. She loved that cabin more than any place on earth. It was a 2-hour drive north of Barrie, on the eastern shore of Lake Temagami. 3 bedrooms, a dock we rebuilt ourselves, a wood stove that rattled when the wind came off the water. We spent every August there for 22 years. When she got sick, we spent her last real summer up there too, the 2 of us sitting on the dock with our feet in the water, not saying much, just watching the loons. After she died, I kept the property. Of course I did. Our daughter, Melissa, had grown up there. She knew every inch of that shoreline. She used to catch frogs off the dock when she was 6, and she had her 18th birthday up there. A bonfire with 15 kids that went until 2 in the morning. That's who she was then. That's not who she became. Melissa met her husband, Garrett, when she was 31. He was a real estate agent in Calgary who'd relocated to Barrie for, I was never entirely sure what. Some partnership, some opportunity. He wore expensive sneakers and had an opinion on everything, and within 18 months of their wedding, he had Melissa half convinced that I was, as he once put it at dinner, not particularly good with money. I hadn't said anything that evening. I just poured myself more coffee and let it go. But things shifted quietly after that. Little comments. Melissa asking about my plans for the cabin, whether I'd considered liquidating it, whether I'd thought about downsizing. I noticed she stopped coming to the cabin herself, said it was too far, said it was run down. Once, after a long silence over the phone, she said, "Dad, honestly, it's just a lot of emotional baggage. Mom's gone. You have to move forward." That one landed. I won't pretend it didn't. I did move forward. Just not the way she expected. What Melissa didn't know, what neither she nor Garrett had any reason to think about, was that 2 years before any of this started, I had quietly transferred the cabin into a numbered corporation under the advice of my accountant, a woman named Mrs. Papineau, who'd been handling my affairs for 12 years. It wasn't for tax reasons, though there were benefits to that too. It was because Sandra and I had talked about it before she died. She'd said, plain as anything, "I don't want that place to get sold off in pieces by someone who doesn't know what it means." She hadn't said Melissa's name. She didn't have to. So the numbered corporation, 2317489 Ontario Inc., held the title. I was the sole shareholder and director. The property had never been in my personal name. There was nothing in writing linking Melissa to any decision about it. She'd never asked how it was registered. Why would she? She assumed it was mine the way a house is yours. Your name, your deed, done. What she'd signed, or rather what Garrett had gotten her to sign on what he called a power of attorney for your father's personal assets. A document I never agreed to, never foresaw, and had certainly never authorized, was utterly worthless against the corporation's title. I found out about the sale not from Melissa, but from a man named Kirk Biosaleo, a property lawyer in North Bay who called my cell phone on a Monday morning in March to confirm some details about the transaction. He seemed surprised when I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. There was a silence on the line. "Mr. Holt," he said slowly, "your daughter presented documentation indicating she had authority to act on your behalf in the sale of this property." "She doesn't," I said, "and the property isn't held in my personal name. It's in a numbered company. She has no authority over that company, no signing authority, no directorship, nothing." Another silence. "I see," he said. "Who's the buyer?" I asked. He told me, a numbered company out of Mississauga, which, as I later found out with very little effort, Garrett had incorporated 6 months earlier. He was selling my cabin to himself through a paper company using a fake power of attorney for well under market value. I thanked Mr. Beausoleil for his time. I told him not to proceed with the transaction, and then I called my own lawyer. Her name was Ms. Delacroix. She'd been a real estate litigator in Barrie for 20 years, and when I walked into her office that afternoon and laid out what had happened, she looked at the documents I'd brought, including the power of attorney Garrett had drawn up, which someone had managed to forge my signature on, and she said very quietly, "Norman, this is fraud." "I know," I said. "This is criminal fraud. Not a civil matter. Criminal." "I know that too." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "You want to go to the police." "I want to do it right," I said. "Walk me through it." What followed was 3 weeks of work. Miss Delacroix filed an emergency injunction to freeze any attempted transfer of the property. She contacted the Ontario Land Registry and flagged the property as subject to a legal dispute. She also prepared a formal complaint with the Ontario Provincial Police's Financial Crimes Unit, which, along with the documented evidence of the forged signature and the fraudulent power of attorney, was enough to open a full investigation. I didn't tell Melissa any of this. She'd called me twice more during those weeks, once to ask if I was feeling okay, and once to say that she and Garrett were getting everything organized. I let both calls go to voicemail. I kept each one. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late April. It was from an OPP detective named Sergeant Fontaine, who told me they would be executing a search warrant at Garrett's office that afternoon. He asked if I had any questions. I didn't. I drove to the Tim Hortons on Dunlop Street and sat with a large coffee and a raisin bran muffin, Sandra's favorite, and I thought about the dock at the cabin, and about the way the water looks at 6 in the morning when the mist is still on it, and I thought about my wife's voice, which I can still hear if I try, and I said to her, quietly, I took care of it. Garrett was arrested at his office at 3:20 in the afternoon. Melissa was brought in for questioning the same evening. She was not arrested that day, but she was cautioned, and she was told she was the subject of an ongoing investigation. She called me at 9:47 that night. "Dad." Her voice was different now, not the breezy confidence from before. Something smaller. "Dad, I need you to explain to them that this was a misunderstanding." I sat in my kitchen in the dark, the same kitchen where she'd stood so many times as a child, and I said, "Melissa, I don't think it was a misunderstanding. Garrett said you'd agree. He said you told him the cabin was a liability and you wanted to be done with it. Did he show you that in writing?" A pause. "He said he lied to you," I said. "Or he used you, I don't know which yet, but what he did with that power of attorney is a criminal offense. And what happened to my signature is a criminal offense. And I did not agree to any of this." She started to cry then. I let her. I listened to her cry for a long time without saying anything because I didn't have anything that was going to make it better, and because I wasn't going to say it was fine when it wasn't. Eventually she said, "What's going to happen?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "That depends on what they find and what the Crown decides. I'm not in charge of that part." "Are you pressing charges?" I'm cooperating fully with the investigation, I said. That's all I can tell you. The investigation ran for 4 months. What it uncovered was worse than what I'd initially understood. Garrett had done this before, not the same scheme, but variations of it. There was a couple in Collingwood. There was an elderly man in Aurelia whose family had signed over a cottage property under similar circumstances. The OPP Financial Crimes Unit coordinated with the RCMP on elements that crossed provincial jurisdiction because one of Garrett's numbered companies had been registered in Alberta. He was charged with fraud over $5,000, forgery, uttering a forged document, and breach of trust. The Collingwood and Aurelia matters added additional counts. He was denied bail the first time, on the grounds that he was considered a flight risk, not without reason, since the Crown presented evidence he'd looked into properties in Portugal. Melissa was not charged. The investigation concluded she had been manipulated rather than complicit. She didn't know about the forged signature. She genuinely believed Garrett had some arrangement with me that I'd quietly agreed to, because that's what he'd told her, and she'd believed her husband over her father. That particular piece of it I had to sit with for a while. She came to see me in late August. She drove up to Barrie by herself, and she sat across from me at my kitchen table, and she looked the way people look when they've lost something heavy that they were carrying, not lighter exactly, but emptier. The way you are when the weight you've been hauling turns out to have been the wrong weight entirely. She said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I know that's not enough." I said, "It's a start." She said, "He told me you'd always thought of the cabin as an obligation, that you'd told him you wanted to be free of it." "I've never said that to anyone," I said. "In 35 years, I have never said that." She looked at the table. "I believed him. I know you did." There was a long quiet. Outside, the birch trees were moving in the wind off Kempenfelt Bay, and somewhere on the street a kid was riding a bicycle, and I could hear the sound of it going past. "The cabin's still yours," she said. "Or yours. The company's. I know. What are you going to do with it?" I looked at my daughter who'd caught frogs off the dock and had her 18th birthday with a bonfire, and had, somewhere along the way, stopped coming, stopped calling, except when she needed something, stopped knowing me the way she once did. My daughter, who had also just spent 4 months watching her marriage collapse and her husband face the prospect of federal prison. "I'm going to open it up," I said. "Go up there in September. The bass fishing is good in September." She nodded. "You could come," I said, "if you wanted." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know if I deserve that." "Probably not," I said, "but the offer's there." Garrett pleaded guilty in November to 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to 4 years in a federal institution in Ontario. The numbered company he'd incorporated in Mississauga was wound up by court order. The attempted sale was voided. The Collingwood couple got restitution. The man in Aurelia got his cottage back. My cabin is still mine. Right now, as I'm saying this to you, I can picture the dock. I can picture the water, gray and cold this time of year, and the birch trees on the far shore, and the way the ice will start to form at the edges in December. Just a thin skin of it at first, barely there. Sandra used to say that what she loved about that place was that it didn't ask anything of you. You just showed up, and it was there, and that was enough. She was right. She usually was. I showed up, I made sure it was still there. That turned out to be enough.